It's early morning on October 2nd, 2018 in Chicago, Illinois. A 26-year-old U.S. Postal Service worker is getting ready for her shift. It's still dark outside. She's heading out for the day the same way she always does, following a routine she's used to, one that people around her could count on. At this point in her life, things were beginning to shift in a different way. She was preparing to become a mother. She was about 3 months pregnant and stepping into a new chapter that those closest to her knew she was excited about. That morning, she walks out, heading to work. Her route is familiar. Her schedule is consistent. She's expected to be there, but she never arrives. Hours later, her car is found nearby. Her phone, her belongings, everything she would need for the day, still inside. And in the short distance between her home and where she was supposed to be, Kierra Coles disappears. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Case Uncovered, where we uncover some of the most compelling and lesser-known true crime cases. I'm your host, Jen Rivera, and this is Missing in the Midwest, where I cover unsolved disappearances across the Midwest, cases that leave behind questions, and families who are still searching for answers. Today's case takes us to my hometown of Chicago, Illinois. A case that's built around a very small window of time, a routine that should have been predictable, and a moment that, when you start to break it down, becomes harder to explain the more you look at it. This is the disappearance of Kierra Coles. Kierra Coles was 26 years old, living on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood she knew well, surrounded by family and people who were a consistent part of her life. She worked for the United States Postal Service, a job that required early mornings, discipline, and reliability. And those who knew her say that's exactly who she was. She showed up. She followed through. She was dependable in a way that people could count on, not just in her job, but in her relationships. Kierra was close with her family, especially her mother, Karen Phillips, with whom she stayed in regular contact. The kind of relationship where even small changes didn't go unnoticed. She wasn't someone who went quiet. She wasn't someone who disappeared from people's lives without explanation. She had a presence, someone who checked in, someone who stayed connected, someone who was always there. And at the time she went missing, Kierra was in a relationship and stepping into a new chapter of her life. She was about 3 months pregnant, and from everything shared by her family, this was something she was really excited about, something she was preparing for, a future that was already beginning to take shape in a real and meaningful way. She had stability, a job she showed up to, a routine people could rely on, relationships that mattered to her, and something ahead of her that she was looking forward to, being a mom. When you look at all of that together, it paints a very clear picture. Kierra had direction. She had reasons to stay around, reasons to continue showing up, which is what makes what happens next so difficult to understand, because nothing about her life suggests someone who was about to walk away from it. Nothing about her behavior suggests someone who was planning to disappear. Everything points to someone who was moving forward. And then, in the span of a single morning, she's gone. That morning in early October, the south side of Chicago was still quiet. It was the kind of hour where most people were still asleep, where the streets hadn't fully come to life yet. But for Kierra, mornings like this weren't unusual. Working for USPS meant early shifts, early starts, and a routine that required her to be up and moving before most people were even awake. From everything that's been shared, the morning began the way you would expect it to. There are no reports of anything unusual inside the home, no signs of distress, nothing that would suggest something was off. At some point, Kierra gets ready for work. She leaves her home, dressed for her shift, stepping into a routine she had followed countless times before. And from that moment on, the timeline becomes very small and very important, because the distance between where she lived and where her car is later found isn't far. This isn't a long commute. This isn't a situation where she disappears hours into her day. This is a short window, a very short window. At some point after leaving home, Kierra's car ends up parked near her residence, in an area that wouldn't immediately raise concern to someone passing by. Inside the car, her personal belongings are still there, items she would have needed for work, items you don't leave behind if you're planning to go anywhere. And that detail matters because it suggests something interrupted her morning. Something happened before her day could even begin. As the morning keeps going, this is where things start to feel off, because at some point earlier, Kierra has called in sick to work. So the day wasn't supposed to go the way it normally would. She wasn't expected to be there. She wasn't rushing to clock in. But then the timeline doesn't follow that, because not long after that, there's a video of her outside, walking in her neighborhood, still wearing her postal uniform. And that's where it starts to not make sense. If she called in sick, why is she still dressed for work? Why is she still out moving around like she's going about her normal morning? That's not something you can just brush off. As the hours go by, the people closest to her start realizing something isn't right. Kierra stayed in contact with her mom. That was just part of their relationship. So when she stopped answering, when there's no response at all to her calls and texts, it stands out pretty quickly. This isn't someone who just disappears for the day and checks back in later. That wasn't like Kierra. And it doesn't take long before the silence starts to feel very wrong. By that night, her mom makes the decision to report her missing. The same day, within hours of realizing something was off. And that says a lot, because this wasn't something that took time to figure out. It didn't take days. It didn't take people wondering. They knew pretty quickly that something was really wrong. And this is the part where the case starts to get harder to follow, because the timeline doesn't just stop when she leaves home. There are signs that things continued after that. Activity that doesn't fully line up with one clear version of what happened. And then there's her relationship. At the time, Kierra was seeing someone. And that relationship becomes part of the investigation as detectives work to understand who was in her life and who may have been with her that day. That doesn't explain what happened to her, but it does become part of the picture investigators have to look at. When you look at this part of the story, it's not clean. It doesn't move in a straight line. It's one piece that doesn't match the next. And that's what makes this moment so important, because this is where the case shifts from a normal morning to something that clearly went wrong. And from here on out, everything comes back to trying to understand what happened in that space. As investigators start working through the timeline, everything leads back to one place, Kierra's car. As we know, it's found not far from her home. Nothing about it screams emergency at first glance. It just looks normal, like someone parked and walked away. But once you start looking closer, that's when it shifts, because inside the car, Kierra's belongings are still there. Her phone, her purse, everything she would have needed for the day. Everything you take with you if you're going to work or going anywhere at all. And that's what makes it feel off. People don't just leave those things behind, not without a reason. When you look at a scene like this, there are only a few ways it usually goes. Someone parks and leaves intentionally, or something interrupts them before they can continue. And with Kierra, the second one is what people keep coming back to, because nothing about this looks planned. Nothing about this looks like someone deciding to step away from their life. It looks like a day that stopped mid-motion. There are no clear signs pointing to exactly what happened in that moment, no immediate answers waiting at the scene. And that's where the tension in this case really starts to build. Because from this point forward, everything becomes about what happened between those moments. Between stepping out that morning and never making it any further. As investigators continue to work through this case, one of the most important pieces comes from surveillance, because this is where Kierra is last seen. She was seen close to home, moving through the same area she would have been in that morning. And in that footage, she's not alone. There's someone with her, a man walking alongside her. The two of them moving through the neighborhood together. And it doesn't look chaotic. It doesn't look like a struggle. At least not in the way people might expect. It looks controlled, like a moment that doesn't immediately stand out unless you know what you're looking at. When you watch that footage back, it's not just that she's with someone, it's how close they are, how in step they seem, how the moment doesn't draw attention in the way something more obvious might, which makes it easy to miss. Easy for something like that to happen in plain sight without anyone realizing what they're seeing. And that's what makes this part of the case so unsettling, because this isn't a disappearance that happens completely unseen. There's a moment, there's movement, there's a person there. That man becomes someone investigators need to understand, someone they need to identify, speak to, and place within the timeline. And over time, more information comes out about who Kierra was connected to, including the man she had been seeing. Someone who, as it later becomes known, had a separate life outside of that relationship. He had a wife, children, a situation that wasn't fully visible at the time. And because of that connection, attention naturally shifts in that direction. Not as a conclusion, but as part of the picture investigators are trying to build. Because when someone disappears in a moment like this, the people closest to them become part of that timeline, part of the questions, and part of what has to be looked at. According to people who knew Kierra, there were those who believed that the man seen in that surveillance footage was that same man, the man she was in a relationship with, the father of her unborn child. That identification has been described as coming from those familiar with her life and her relationships. But it's important to be clear here. That has never been officially confirmed by investigators in a way that led to charges. So while that connection has been discussed and believed by some close to her, it remains part of the broader picture of the case, not a conclusion. Even with surveillance, even with a visual moment that places her with someone, there are still gaps. There's no clear resolution in that footage. No moment where everything becomes obvious. Just a piece of the timeline. A glimpse into what may have been her last confirmed movements. And then, nothing that follows. Because now the case isn't just built around what was found. It's built around what was seen. A moment that happened in the open, in a place that should have been familiar, at a time that should have been routine. And still, it didn't stop anything from happening. This is the part of cases like this that always resonates with me. It's how normal everything feels right before something changes. Just going about your day, doing something you've done 100 times. And that's something I don't take lightly anymore because of my own experiences. A lot of you know this about me. I'm a sexual assault survivor, and for me it didn't happen in some extreme obvious situation. It happened in a moment that felt completely normal. That's why I keep the Safely Sidekick on my keys. It's compact, easy to carry, and it combines a personal alarm, pepper spray, a flashlight, and a glass breaker. So if something ever did happen, I'm not trying to figure it out in the moment. I already have protection with me. To purchase your own Safely Sidekick, visit livesafely.co and use my code JEN for 10% off your order. Thank you to Safely for sponsoring today's episode. Now, let's get back to the case. As the investigation continues, attention begins to center around this man that was seen in the surveillance footage. The man that her friends and family believes is the father of her child and the person she was in a relationship with. And they try to figure out what exactly happened that day, the timeline surrounding when they were together and when he was no longer seen with Kierra. But here's the challenge. They don't have a clear scene. They don't have a long trail to follow. They don't have distance to work with. Everything happens in such a small area in a small window of time, which means whatever happened quickly, and it didn't leave behind what investigators would normally expect. There's always the question in cases like this, could Kierra have left on her own? But when you look at Kierra's life, that doesn't sit right. She had a routine. She had a job she showed up to. She stayed in contact with her family, and she was expecting a baby. Everything about her life at that moment pointed forward, not away. And that's really what people come back to in this case. What doesn't fit? The routine that breaks, the timeline that doesn't fully connect, the moment that feels like it should have an answer but doesn't. Because there's no clear explanation for how someone disappears in that kind of space, in that kind of time, without something standing out. Despite the efforts of investigators, no one has ever been charged in connection to Kierra's disappearance. So instead of one answer, there are questions that stay. What happened after that last sighting? What happened between her leaving that morning and her car being found? Who knows more than they've said? And what part of that day hasn't been fully understood yet? For Kierra's family, this isn't something that stays in the past. This is something they live with every single day. A morning that never finished, a timeline that never picked back up, and a space where answers should be, but aren't. Her mother has continued to speak out, to keep her name out there, and to make sure people don't forget. Because for families in cases like this, that's what matters. That someone is still looking. That someone is still listening. That someone still cares about what happened and about bringing her home. If you have any information about the disappearance of Kierra Coles, please contact the Chicago Police Department Area South Special Victims Unit at 312-747-8274. Even the smallest detail can make a difference in this case. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode of Case Uncovered's Missing in the Midwest. Make sure to follow the show wherever you're listening to podcasts so you don't miss new episodes of Case Uncovered every Tuesday and Thursday. And if you've been listening for a while, or even if this is your first time here, leaving a 5-star rating and review is the best way you can support the show. Case Uncovered is an independent podcast, and every rating and review helps these cases reach more people. And you never know, it could lead to somebody who knows something about the case. To keep up with the advocacy work I'm doing through the Reignited Project, or find ways to get involved, you can visit thereignitedproject.com. You can also connect with me on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Jen Rivera Investigates. Thank you for being here and for taking the time to listen to Kierra's story. And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and stay safe out there.